Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the House Committee on General and Housing, and it is still the 15th of January. And this afternoon, we are going to be hearing first from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and then also a member of a regional planning commission, and then also from VAPTA, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. And we have from 1 until 2 with the Housing and Conservation Board. So I'll tell you what, welcome. And what we'll do is have the committee introduce themselves to you, and then you can introduce yourself. Why don't we start here?
All right. Hello, welcome back. Emily Krasnow, South Burlington, Chittenden 9.
Saudia Lamont, Slomo, Washington District, Morristown, Elmore, Worcester, Woodbury, and a small part Stowe.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows. I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor, and Windsor.
So I'm Mary Howard and I represent Rutland District 6.
I'm Debbie Dolgan and I represent St. Johnsbury, Kirby, and Concord.
Charlton, representing Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Wyndham.
Joe Parsons, Groton, Topsom, and Newburgh.
Nora Dodge, City of Essex Junction and Town of Essex.
Ashley Bartley, Fairfax, in Georgia.
And I'm Martin Holly, Callis, Plainfield, and Marshfield, and welcome. Delighted you're here. Why don't you introduce yourselves formally with your names and take it away.
For the record, Gus Seelig, I'm the director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I live in East Callis, a few hundred feet from the chair, so we know each other well. I think he's talked to you about various relationships our family have on a number of matters. I've been at this quite a long time, since this program was begun in the 80s, and had a background before then at a community action agency and served about 11 years as a volunteer firefighter. And I love the town of Chester because my softball team won 2 state championships on the fields there.
See that, Molly?
Hi, I'm Polly Major. I'm the Director of Policy and Special Projects for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I live in Berlin. Originally, I'm from Westminster, and my father used to always say, you can go on a horseback ride, but you can only go as far as Athens. I couldn't actually find Athens on trail, but he could.
You can find it on the road.
I've been with VHCB for about 2 years. Prior to that, I worked with Senator Leahy doing federal housing policy for him.
Great, thank you. We have about an hour. Thank you for your participation. Take it away.
Okay, so what we want to do, I know some of you are familiar with the Housing and Conservation Board and some of you are not. And so for those of you who are hearing us, and I apologize if some of this is repetitive, we will probably hit a few of the slides we showed you at the legislative orientation in December. Just want to acknowledge that Chad from BHFA, our partner organization, is with us today. The chair asked me a number of questions to think about over the weekend. I hope we'll discuss them through this presentation.
I like your slide that a lot there.
And I do want to describe VHCB's role in the continuum of providing housing, talk about the policy choices in front of you, the impacts we've had. We have focused very much, I think, on the governor's priorities of making the state more affordable, of protecting vulnerable citizens, and absolutely in improving the economy. Our housing programs have touched 149 communities, but our various programs have touched many more, and rural Vermont is really important to me and to my board. Anyway, we'll start with this slide, which is, I live right behind this building for 30 years. I live a half mile up the hill today. I watched 4 different families work really hard over those years, keeping the store going 7 days a week. And then in 2019, it crashed and closed because the business model didn't work. And none of those families, even though they worked really hard, could really ever invest in the building. VHCB had 4 different roles in this project, and the chair knows it better than I do because he helped lead the effort to restore the store to the village. But we have a lead paint program that provided a grant to mitigate the lead paint. We provided housing dollars for the 3 apartments here. We have a historic preservation as part of our conservation mission, so we made a historic preservation grant which we do for all kinds of community gathering places and communities. Sometimes they are former there's now an arts building in downtown Morrisville that was once the Grange's building, so we do those kinds of projects as well. And then finally, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, but we'll focus most of our energy today on housing. We have a program called the Rural Economic Development Initiative, and what that program does is provide grant writing support for towns under 5,000 and for businesses in those towns. And that grant writer helps secure both the Northern Borders grant for this project and a community development block grant that the community never would have had the capacity to go after without that help. So when I say we're focused on rural communities, this is the smallest multifamily project we've ever done. We did do 7 apartments in Cabot some years ago. It is much harder, and the governor's right to call for a focus on infrastructure. It's much harder to do these kinds of projects when there is no infrastructure, and gotten harder over the years, especially with the permitting to operate a water system for anything large. We have worked in communities like Groton in the past. It doesn't have infrastructure, but it's pretty hard to get developers to say they want to go to a community and do multifamily housing in that way.
By the way, the Ready grant, which he described, I just want to say, is probably the quickest money that is in existence. You can get a Ready grant to do planning, like if you have a project. I don't know, I think a couple of weeks, 10 days, you can get a Ready grant. It's sort of the first thing you can do and use it to hire a professional or do other things.
One of the things that was written into our enabling statute, which we can find at 10 VSA chapter 15, is that the board is to consider the need for a timely response to unpredictable circumstances or special opportunities. And we love that section because it kind of says to us as a board, be creative and be responsive. And so whether it's a fire or flood, or a program like Ready where somebody has a great idea, but they don't know how to go about raising the money, we get to it quickly. The biggest thing that we want to report on, and you saw an earlier version, we've had a couple more board meetings of this slide, is what we have done with all the money that was pointed in our direction. We don't do this work alone. The HFA is a key partner. The CD program is sometimes a partner in some of these deals, but this is the bulk of how we spent $377.5 million so far. And it leveraged close to $700 million. So there's been about $1 billion investment in real estate as affordable housing that you've helped us make over the last 4 years. And for those of you who've been here, please pat yourselves on the back for having done that and accept our thanks. The biggest thing we do is to build rental housing, but we are very much involved in home ownership. You can see there's a home access program that almost 400 households have benefited from. And there's a big part of our work that is about avoiding other costs. So if you think about somebody who lives in a house and ultimately needs a wheelchair, if they become housebound, that's a real problem for their emotional health, for their family. And maybe they even end up in nursing home. And the cost of that to the public is much higher. So while those grants are small, their impact is very significant. We've worked a lot with the mobile home community across the state. With the one-time funding, we began a program, and your colleagues in the Ag Committee are pleased about this, to repair farm worker housing, sometimes to replace it. When Jolinda LeClaire was working for the governor on opioid abuse, the last thing she said to me as she was leaving state government is, if there's one thing that you can do to help with the opioid epidemic, it's to build recovery residences. And in the next 2 months, there'll be 4 projects fully operational with 58 or 59 beds all over the state, from Bennington to Essex and Barry as well. And we expect more. So that's the broad view of what we've been up to over time. Here's our statutory purpose and a little bit about our dual mission. And again, I'm not going to talk to you today about agriculture or natural areas in a big way, but here you're looking at downtown St. John, two buildings in downtown St. Johnsbury. The first of them is actually a rebuild, and although it looks pretty historic to me, that burned to the building that had been there burned to the ground. Former Representative Beck operates the bookstore there. We did it about 20 years ago, maybe 25. I didn't check the dates before I got here. And when we did it, we got super expensive. It was more than $150,000 per apartment, but it was a key location. Flash forward a decade, more than a decade later, and St. Johnsbury had been through, at least from my distance, you tell me if I get it wrong, really hard times. And there was finally an election and the whole city council changed in one election. And then there was a community visit by a group called the Council on Rural Development. And they went through a process of helping the community set priorities. And they said, this building that you see in the bottom left is an absolute slum. And we can't, there's 10,000 feet of commercial space that was bought by an out-of-state investor somewhere around 1990, maybe a little bit before that. He got a Section 8 contract, which gave him a great cash flow. But he ran it into the ground. There was 10,000 square feet of commercial space left vacant for most of the 30 years of his tenure. And the community said, we can't turn around our downtown until this building gets fixed. We worked with Senator Kitchell on this, got a special appropriation, and then ultimately went into rehab that got finished a couple of years ago in the midst of the pandemic. We thought this was super expensive when we agreed to fund it. It was a little over $320,000 per unit. Today, that looks like a great bargain. I can't defend how expensive affordable housing has become to do. It is beyond anything I would have imagined at any point in my career. But what I can say to you is when I look backward, every investment we make, if you wait 5 to 10 years, it looks like, oh, glad we did it then because it would cost us so much more to replace today. If you live in downtown St. Johnsbury, Observatory Knob is a conservation project that is nearby and provides a place for the community to recreate, for people to have a peaceful place to be. I'm not telling you that all the problems of St. Johnsbury are finished, but there was a big historic preservation conference a year and a half ago, and it's doing much better. And there are still challenges. There's still challenges of opioids in every downtown in the state, but we try to make this kind of difference. Here are a few other communities. The building top left, which you can't see, is called the Union Block. It was just called by the social service workers in Windsor the Block for many, many years, and owned by the same guy out of state that owned the building in St. Johnsbury. And when we did that, it was like $268 a unit, the most expensive at the time, without any question. But it was, and you go to the playground behind the building and there were needles there. And I'm talking 2006, before the opioid epidemic. We've worked in downtown Morrisville, the Arthur's Block, sat vacant for many years. It was an iconic setting, department store, family run. And when they closed, buildings just sat vacant, and renovating them became a big deal. This year, we opened Village Center Apartments right in the downtown, a great infill project. And both of these communities have recreation amenities either in town or nearby. There was a story in the New York Times about Mount Ascutney after the lodge burned. A community group came to us to buy it. Times article was titled something like "A Town That Saved a Mountain and a Mountain That Saved a Town." Real estate values had actually gone down in Ascutney after the ski area closed. This was a community effort for bike trails. They've kind of taken a lesson from Kingdom Trails, wanting to bring that kind of recreation to their community. I think they now have a tow rope so kids can still ski there.
We have a T-bar.
Do you? Yeah. And if you've never been to Green River Reservoir State Park, it took 10 years for us to conserve it. It's the largest body of water in Vermont from which you do not see houses. It's just a magnificent place, and we turned it into a state park. It was owned by the Morrisville Water and Light Company, and they could not, there are many islands here for overnight camping. They couldn't manage it. So that's a bit about our work. And again, that we're focused on our downtowns, our village centers. We are focused very much today on new neighborhoods near our downtowns, and there's about 8, I think, under construction in various places.
Dr. Burrows, you have a question?
I just wanted crow that the historic homes of Runnymede were my great grandmother's house and my cousin's houses.
And one of them, at one time, was owned by United States Secretary of State, as I am recalling the history. And I want to say, it took me 10 years to get Vermont Pipe to do a story on us back when they were a publication of merit. And when they interviewed this woman who lives here, this building is shared housing. There's some independent apartments and also a level 3-4 home. What she said to them was, you can't live here and feel poor. It's just too beautiful. But these buildings were all crumbling. The foundations had rotted out. They had been really serious deterioration right along Route 5. But a lovely location to rebuild and lovely bones in the buildings. This is what we've done across our 37-year history. And I'm happy individually or another occasion to talk about farmland, natural areas. I'll talk briefly about our support in one slide about the working lands and how we serve them. But here's to focus on housing for a moment. Our statute asks us to make investments that will permanently protect resources, and I'll talk about why we think that's important. We serve both low and moderate income Vermonters, up to 120% of median. Statute tells us, as the governor asks us, to pay attention to geographical distribution. And as I said before, a timely response to unpredictable circumstances are among our legislative charges. When I began in this work, I was told there were 3 Ps to affordable housing. The first is to preserve existing housing. The second is to protect vulnerable people, and the third is to produce more housing. And I think the idea of permanent affordability kind of overarches all of that. Building on the left was developed by the Copley Hospital in the early 1980s. And about 1.5 years ago, they announced that they were thinking they would convert it to market rate housing to provide housing for their nurses. Well, there are some residents who moved in there 40 years ago. It's a project for the elderly. The disruption in their lives would have been enormous. This year, we are going to close in a few weeks. We made a grant, and Evernorth, in conjunction with Downstreet, will buy it and keep it as affordable housing, keep the Section 8 contracts in place, and nobody will leave their community. So protecting the vulnerable also means not displacing people, creating permanent community assets. But we also need to produce, and I'll talk more in a little bit about this new neighborhood in Shelburne that we are undertaking that'll have 94 homes in it. It's a tax credit project that we work on with groups like VHFA. We're also doing 26 condominiums there, again, in conjunction with VHFA and their financing.
Gus, can I interrupt you just to talk a little bit about this gentleman, Steve, here in the middle?
Please.
So Steve is a gentleman who experienced homelessness. He was sheltered through the state's motel program. And when Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust was able to redevelop a garage in downtown Bellows Falls, he was finally able to secure housing there. And he talked a little bit about what that housing meant. And I think his quote really shows you how housing and healthcare are intertwined, because he said, "I've come a long way, believe me. Everything is good, but as long as I maintain my health. It's pretty incredible considering that 6 years ago, they gave me only a 25% chance. That's what housing can do. If I weren't where I am right now, I know my health would just go downhill." So housing's really at the intersection of the state's challenges with healthcare as well.
So permanent affordability, as I said, is part of our mission. And I just want to talk about 3 things. The Bohm brothers announced their plans. They are housing developers to evict 25 families, 24 families or 25 in Winooski a couple of years ago. There was a great community outcry. They backed off from that, said they weren't gonna convert it to market housing. But a year later, they said, well, we've decided to tear these buildings down and build something much bigger. So the families will be displaced. And they probably will not be coming back into a market rate building from what I can see. In 1989, one of the reasons Governor Cunin, who you see pictured here, invented us was to save a place called Northgate Apartments in Burlington. It is the largest rental housing complex in the state. We invested $2.9 million in a $22 million deal. So aside from wanting to make sure that we protect vulnerable people, that they don't feel the pain of displacement, what I'd say to you about a policy of permanent affordability is that it is keeping us from having to replace units, and the replacement cost, and I'll emphasize this more than once, of Northgate today would be at least $170 million. Should you be fortunate enough to find a site in Burlington at a really low price, so I think this estimate is low, where you could put 336 homes near the lake. We thought it was ripe for condo conversion at that time, and it would just be an enormous lift to try and replace it today. So permanent affordability both protects vulnerable people, it protects us from having to replace it, it recycles the public investment from one generation to the next. So I have always viewed it as the fiscally conservative approach to how you invest in housing. There are other ways to do it. I think very highly of the VHIP program, which has been a great support to landlords all over the state, and functions pretty quickly and pretty efficiently. I am not here to suggest that it's one or the other, but I am here to suggest that when you get an asset and keep it affordable and not displace people from their communities, that has a high value too. And it saves us ultimately money over the long run, because we don't have to buy the asset back or rebuild in another location. Just a couple of examples. This is in terms of our work in rural communities. This is in Townsend, very close to Grace Cottage Hospital, where we first built independent apartments and then an assisted living wing, probably about 20 years ago. Again, the cost back then was very high. It was a very difficult site to work on, but it got done. Here's another picture from Representative Burrows' district of the historic homes of Runnymede. Now we wanted to talk a bit about permanent affordability for home ownership, and we take an approach called shared appreciation. And do you want to talk through this a bit? But fundamentally, we've invested in 1,400 homes across the state. There have been 680 of resales, sometimes in the case of the home you see here in southern Vermont, 3 different times. The first 2 families went on to conventional home ownership. The next family struggled and went back to renting, and a young family bought it again. So over 2,000 households have been served by this program over the course of our history. There's another 100 or so that are in development or in construction as we speak, including those homes in Shelburne. And we have another slide where we walk through the mechanics of how shared appreciation works. But again, it saves money from one generation to the next, because we don't need to subsidize when the new buyer comes in. We've built up a subsidy because people agree they're only going to walk away with a quarter of the appreciation plus the pay down of their equity, the earning of their equity as they pay down their mortgage. Mr. Chairman, you asked me to talk about what the market can produce and the gaps, and this attempts to do it. It may not be the most elegant presentation, but in 2023, the HFA reports that the average new construction home in Vermont costs $615,000. If you had $130,000, $125,000 down payment, you would still need an income of $164,000 a year to afford that home. That's beyond the reach of all the occupations you see listed below. Teachers in elementary school might be starting 60 to 65. I think similar cost for police officers. Mental health counselors, nursing assistants, truck drivers, significantly less. We do serve people, as I said, up to 120% of median. So for a 3-person household, that's about $110,000. We serve people in rental housing up to median income. So we do think we're serving a mix of incomes across our portfolio. But the other thing I will make you aware of is that when we sit down with the folks in the human services community, and we sit down with the appropriators, they are always asking us, what are you going to do for the most vulnerable among us? How do we lower the costs of GA? How do we lower the costs of recidivism by housing people who would otherwise end up in bad trouble? So there's a tension there for all of us that we have to work through together. Yes.
I was just curious if you could talk about how this compares to other states, and I know everyone's different, but if there's some comparable data to other states, or if Vermont is an outlier.
From my experience, the shortage we are experiencing in Vermont, which is driving this and why producing more housing is so vital today, is we are not an outlier in the shortage. And I think at the press conference for the Let's Build Homes campaign, Maura said yesterday that we are building much less housing than we built in the 1980s. There's a lot of reasons for that. But the fundamental reason is that the term affordable housing is an oxymoron. When we look at when people earn, their ability to afford what you can build modestly it's just not within their reach. And I can tell you, a member of my family was going to build on our land 2 years ago, 3 years ago. She sat down with a reputable modular builder and said, what can I get a home for? She wanted 1,500 square feet. It was the model she settled on. And she said, what will it cost? We were in the middle of the pandemic. He said, I can't build your house for more than a year. I have so many orders. So give me a deposit. You'll get it back if you don't like the price, but things are just changing too much. A year later, she called up and said, okay, you're supposed to deliver in 3 months. What's it going to cost? 1,500 square foot house without a septic system, without a well, without a driveway, without bringing the electric in, and without the cost of land was going to be $438 2 years ago.
Wow.
So add in those costs and you get well over $500,000 to build not a starter castle on Spear Street, not a 3,000 square foot home with
So targeted.
6 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, but a modest home. That's what the market is producing today. And we are up against all of those factors as we try to build housing.
Thank you.
And again, if you're just looking at the average cost to purchase a home in 2023 that was not newly built, you're still needing, even with a VHFA 5% down payment, an income of probably $100,000 plus. So again, in terms of all those occupations listed, if you have a 2-person family with 2 good incomes and you don't have a huge amount of student debt, you don't have childcare expenses,
You're not sick.
it may be doable. Back when I was a young man in Vermont, it used to be that the banks would lend you money and you could have a house that had a finished first floor and an unfinished second floor. The banks won't lend on properties like that anymore. You might get a credit union here and there to do it. They can't sell those loans on the secondary market. So that's a part of our problem is that you can't do that. You self-help kind of thing that so many of my friends were able to do in the 70s and 80s. This just wanted to hit the note of serving rural communities. And this is just a few more examples of the reach of the Rural Economic Development Initiative in some of the communities that you represent, grants that we help communities get. And I would just say, Madam Vice Chair, we are not doing multifamily housing in Fairfax yet. I know you're focused on infrastructure. That's a great thing. We have done a home access project in your community. We are doing a farm labor housing project in your community. So
Love it.
we pay attention to every community, though we can't always bring a big multifamily investment to. Okay,
So I'm gonna talk through some of the nuts and bolts of the housing programs that we administer. You heard Gus talk about the big philosophy and the impact of our work. We have a whole suite of housing programs that we administer, and they really stretch from home ownership through manufactured housing, rental housing, to serving specialized populations, including shelter for Vermonters experiencing homelessness. And the reason for this really diverse approach to housing is because we serve really diverse communities around the state, both geographic communities and diverse populations. And so we find that we need this really textured approach so that there is something for everyone to be able to use when they want to increase affordable housing for their population.
just before you leave this slide, I just want to say, one of the things we've done on the cost issue have been converting 10 hotels to housing. This is one picture here. It tripled the capacity of the organization that serves victims of domestic violence from 7 places to 21. One of the reasons we took hotels to housing, they could happen faster, and we saved about $100,000 per apartment. So we are interested in finding any way we can to reduce costs wherever we go, but it's not always possible.
On that theme, another cost driver is the lack of labor to build housing. And so we've worked with the Commerce Committee several years ago, created a new program for funding for CTE centers around the state to get students out to actual home sites to work on homes. And that's a program that we've worked with the Vermont Community Loan Fund to create and administer, really working on that workforce end of the housing shortage. You heard Gus talk a little bit about affordable home ownership, and I wanted to walk through how we're able to do that through the shared equity model. So the way shared equity is working is that VHCB or another public source makes a one-time investment in the purchase of a home. And the buyer, what that does is it buys down the cost of the home for that first buyer, and that buyer enters into an agreement to share the equity in the home moving forward with future buyers. So a simple way of thinking about it is if a home accrues $100,000 in equity and the buyer wants to sell, they, as per their agreement, walk away with that $25,000, and the other $75,000 stays in the home as a discount to the future buyer. And that discount grows over time so that even as the market is becoming unaffordable, the home itself remains affordable for future families. And you're seeing this home in Colchester that's been through this evolution since 1993, when it was originally purchased with a $13,000 one-time investment from VHCB. That has grown over time to keep the home affordable, and that original investment, although we're not adding more money to it, its value has grown to about $100,000.
Ollie, can we slow down a little bit on this slide?
Sure.
Okay, so going to the second stage. So now it's worth 194,000. So and that 59,000, is that
So that
that's 75% of the difference between 89 and 194?
the 75% is, for example, I think there are different percentages that are shared. What that is it's their original investment of 13 plus that percentage of the accrued equity that stays with the home.
We do allow, this work we don't do all this work. We work with groups that some of whom you've heard from, like Downstreet, Champlain Housing Trust, and so on and so forth. They agree to buy the homes when somebody is ready to sell, and we market them. So they'll take a fee to do that. So that's what the subsidy is after they've taken their fee. But yes, they maintain it. So in this case, the original family bought it for 89, it's selling for 194. It's 25 years, they've probably paid down most, if not all, of their mortgage, and they're gonna realize about $25,000 in equity. So they'll walk away with something over $100,000. So they're not getting the kind of return you get from making your own investment in the real estate market, but if you accept the but-for argument that they never would have bought this home in the first place without this help, and they have agreed to pay that forward and get another family in, that's what's happening here. And to speak to the power of it, when you get to the third transaction, the home is about tripled in value. The public investment has gone up by a factor of about 10. So
That's what I'm trying to understand. So I just want to get clear, and for members of the committee who are thinking it but not speaking up.
please,
So on the second round, Champlain Housing Trust or somebody literally buys the house for 194K,
or arranges a sale. of it.
arranges the sale, okay. But the new buyer, and they use 59,000 of that.
So that the new buyer gets in not at 194, but at
They
130.
credit them down 59K. And that 59,000, the Champlain Housing Trust keep the 59,000
It's not like cash,
It's like equity in the house.
equity?
it's equity it's public equity in the home.
Yeah, but I mean, where's the money flow?
The buyer is just gonna pay 135,000.
Right? And they use the 59,000 in order to be able to pay 194,000.
Right.
Yeah. Do people understand this? In other words, they, on the $300,000, they'll have to come up with $300,000 to buy the house. But in fact, where the money comes from is 182,000 comes from the new buyer. And the 118,000 is they kept from
Well,
the,
just to be clear, they are, because somebody's agreed to limit their appreciation, they're not paying anybody 194,000 for the home. So the buyer can get only so much for the home.
Mhm.
And then you roll forward that.
I see, so they're not paying the market value, they're paying 130.
Well, if they decided to get it out of the portfolio and we agreed for whatever reason, somebody let the house go to hell, and it needed too much repair, then there'd be a market sale. But they're not making a market sale, they're making a below market sale to another eligible buyer who's gonna be below 120% of median.
So they sell excuse me for being obtuse here, but I want to make sure we nail it down. So in that second round, 194,000 is its market value,
Right.
but they don't pay 194,000 for it. The
Right.
Champlain Housing Trust pays, it's, the amount they pay isn't on here, right?
It says 135. cost.
135 is what the new buyer is gonna.
Yeah, but what does Champlain Housing Trust pay?
They're probably buying it at around 130,000. And then taking a fee for making the transaction work both for the departing entity and the incoming entity.
Right.
And they have a whole program of home ownership counseling to get people ready to understand these transactions, help hook them up. Every buyer has their own legal counsel, so they understand what they're getting into before they.
So the transaction is being subsidized in the sense that the seller isn't selling at fair market value. They're selling at substantially less than fair market value.
Correct.
And that's the cost to the buyer. And so this 59,000 isn't actual real money that's going to anywhere. It's just public investment in the house continuing to grow.
Continuing to grow. And again, recycling the public investment from one generation of buyers to the next.
Representative
Yes.
Dodge, perhaps you can clarify further.
So I know what I'm understanding. The second buyer is only buying the equity that does not belong to the trust.
Correct.
Yes.
It's happening.
I was just curious, since we're talking so much about property taxes and grand lists and all that, whether what this looks like in a town's grand list, just out of curiosity.
There is state law that covers that, and I believe, and I'm not completely up to date, asks the assessors to assess these homes at 70% of fair market value. Because as a homeowner, you don't have access to the full value.
Right. But
Think
folks
of
are
it-
still paying the higher mortgage rates right now, like these.
Yes.
Yeah, we don't, I mean, great deal when you can get in to one of these when mortgage rates are 4.5%. Not as great a deal for any of it. You know, when I bought my first house behind that store, it was 9.5%. So that's beyond our control.
Of course. Okay.
Yes.
It's a good point. Is that other 30% made up anywhere, or is that just the town?
I would think of it the way I'd think of the current use program, that you're asking people to take a discount on what the value of their home is, and therefore.
Yeah, but the town receives a hold harmless payment to cover that. I'm curious if the 30% is,
I don't believe there's a payment to the towns that covers the 30%.
okay.
And I guess I would argue to you that if you want people, as I once was, in your community who will serve on the fire department, be volunteers in the community, getting them into home ownership does give something back to the community.
For sure.
Yeah.
But you're making a fair point that there is a loss to the town. We have not had towns object to participating in this program.
Yeah, to clarify, I mean, I'm 100% behind that. I wanted to make sure that that is what was, that folks weren't being like somehow, you're losing access to your equity and you're still paying full taxes, even though you don't own as much as what you think you own. So
But
I
it's
think
still,
that's fair.
it's still interesting that there's no hold harmless. Yeah,
Yeah, I know, it's certainly nothing that's gonna be a massive factor in your town unless you've got a Ohio event program in one locale.
And these are homes that are across the state, so we see pretty good geographic spread of them. Probably the highest concentration in Burlington, although they're,
There's a fair number in places like Colchester and South Burlington too, but
Yeah.
again, bigger towns will have more of them. Like number up in the St. Albans area now. Some in Barry, some in Montpelier, some in bunch in Brattleboro.
another strategy for homeownership and rental is supporting manufactured home communities. This is work that BHCB has done throughout our existence, and we work primarily with nonprofit and cooperative parks to fund the acquisition of parks, the infrastructure investments in those parks, and also infill housing new homes, in replacement homes in parks. Representative Pezzo and I served together on the Manufactured Home Community Study Committee a couple of years ago that came out with a report that walks through some of the challenges that are faced by these communities and makes some recommendations, a lot of which focused around infrastructure needs. And North Avenue Co-op here is an example of a project where BHCB was able to help this co-op invest in their water and wastewater system to keep the homes viable and affordable. Multifamily housing is a large portion of what we do in housing. We hear about that 25,000 to 36,000 new homes that Vermont needs this decade. And when we look at ways to relatively quickly add a number of homes to communities, multifamily housing is a way to do that. We also heard the governor in his inaugural address talk about the importance of rehabbing downtown structures to create new homes. And here's two examples of places where BHCB is partnering with local developers to fund the rehab of the historic high school in Bennington with a private developer, and a garage at the entrance of Fellows Falls with Wyndham Windsor Housing Trust, a nonprofit developer, to bring new homes online. I'll note that my father is a Vermonter from Westminster and always says garage I have to try not to do that when saying garage. There's projects like this spread throughout the state, and I know we're getting short on time, so I don't want to go into each of these, but I'll just say that the bottom left-hand corner, you see Congress Street's apartments in St. Albans. And St. Albans has a TIF district that it very successfully was able to use to increase infrastructure for housing. And of the over 200 homes that were built in that TIF district, BHCB helped to support over 150 of them. So we're really able to work well with that model. And much like shared equity, I just wanted to take a moment to touch on how this public investment creates affordability in housing. So the public investment in building affordable housing really does two really critical things. First, it leverages federal and private capital to bring it into the building of housing. So here's an example here of Riverwalk in Hartford, 42 units. You had Andrew Winter, and I believe yesterday, who's the executive director of Twin Pines Housing Trust, that worked to develop this building. And this has $6.2 million of HCB funds in it that's leveraging an additional 8.6 million. Across the state, we're seeing that investment in affordable housing bring dollars to Vermont to build housing. Then what these dollars do together is that they help fund the construction so that the building itself doesn't bear as much debt. And in private construction, a private developer may take out a loan or have investment that they then need to repay or recoup using the rent. And rent, when it's in a publicly funded building like this, is going to cover maintenance, but is not going to cover a debt service or a profit. And that's really how we're able to get our rents to be more affordable. So if we look at Riverwalk, it's in the Upper Valley. The market rate rent per unit is about $2,400 a month. And if that's 30% of someone's income, it's affordable to an individual who's making over $82,000 a year. And the public investment in Riverwalk in the construction is able to bring those rents down to between $1,000 and $1,300 per month, making it much more affordable to anyone who's in those professions that we showed earlier, someone who's a senior, someone who's disabled.
Let me say one other thing as we modeled out what market rate rent might be here, which is that private developer, this was actually developed by DEW in what we call a turnkey arrangement to Twin Pines and Evernorth. So they were the developer, they built the building, our partners took it over upon completion. A private developer probably would have needed something called mezzanine debt, which would have been private equity. And my understanding is that people who invest in projects like this would want to get their money out probably within 7 years, 10 years at most. And that means that while 2,400 would have supported the debt we modeled initially as rents, when you wanted to get those when you needed to get your equity investors out, rents would either have to go up or you'd have to convert to some other financing that would let you keep the rents even at that level. So, and in a market like the Upper Valley, which is as difficult to market as any outside of Burlington in the state, maybe more difficult, the potential for the rents to go up even higher than what we modeled here would have been, and the pressure to do so would have been extreme.
To put a magnifying glass on that process. So if this was a private developer and they wanted to get their money out, because they can't get investors if they're going to stay. Most private developers are not going to stay in the project forever. They're going to want to get out. So they want to sell it. And if they sell it, people who decide how much they're going to buy it for are going to look at the total income that comes from the building, which is rents. And they're going to they're going to price it accordingly. So if the original investor wants to make a profit, they have to raise the rents to a level that supports an offer that gives them that profit. Do I understand this correctly?
That's, yes. I think you do, and yeah. So, and you won't get the investors to build the building at all if they don't think they can get their money out. And that's part of why we're not getting enough housing built in Vermont. Or in many other places.
So we have limited time and this is a complicated graph, so this might be something that I just leave with you, but I just want to say that we know we need housing across the income spectrum in Vermont. We need private developers to build housing, and we need housing built with public subsidy. What this graph is showing you is the rent burden felt by different income brackets, and we see that blue line much higher on the lowest income bracket over there on the left. And what this is saying is, this is why Vermont has made a policy choice to put public dollars towards housing that's serving low and moderate income Vermonters, because those are the Vermonters who are struggling most to pay for housing, and in doing so have the least left over to pay for other essential needs such as transportation, food, or healthcare expenses. So wonky chart here, but the takeaway is this is really why the public dollars are going towards that lower end of the income spectrum when we do need housing built across the income spectrum. And when folks are not able to afford housing, they slip through the cracks, are caught by the state programs like the DA program that are expensive to administer. And so we also work to support vulnerable populations through recovery housing, through shelter, through the conversion of hotels to housing. That said, most of the Vermonters who are experiencing homelessness, who are served through VHCB investments, aren't actually in shelters, they're actually in housing. They're within the affordable housing portfolio that 37 years of the state of Vermont's investment has built. Because as units turn over within this broad perpetually affordable portfolio, 37% of those are going to households who have experienced homelessness, including this couple that's shown in St. Albans. Just touched on farm workers and accessibility, so I'm gonna move on to the kind of policy work ahead of this committee.
So you saw this slide if you were at the presentation I did with Laura and Alex, but this is the old Catholic diocese in Burlington that has become a new neighborhood. And a piece of the story here to understand it is there was great opposition initially to development of this site, fierce opposition. We worked with the Vermont Land Trust, who raised the money and got a small grant from us to conserve 12 acres that went to the city along the lake as a park where you wouldn't develop any housing. And that changed the community's attitude about what should happen here. The build out here is 75 units to the acre. And for all of my environmental friends, and I have my name on 500,000 acres of conservation easements, who are concerned about sprawl, what I'd say is if we can build to this density, and we won't, we only need 400 acres to build 30,000 homes. But if we get down to 7 units an acre, we still need just 4,000. And if you cut it to 4, 10,000 acres. So my message to my environmental friends and to you is we do not have to screw up the countryside that we all love to build more densely and to build smart growth where we have on infrastructure. But we will not do it without more capital. We want to enhance density as much as possible. Chair and I have talked about the problems of the appeals process. I was asked that day, how often is NIMBYism a problem? And it usually is not. And lots of communities are moving forward in very positive ways. But we lost 5 units in the downtown building we're building in Windsor because the historic preservation community did not want the building we're building there to be as tall as the historic church down the road, which is actually on the other side of the street. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I would have liked those 5 more apartments and 1 more story there. A different issue is equity and energy policy, and maybe that will get taken up in another committee, but I think we have solar absolutely backwards, which is that somebody with my income can benefit from rooftop solar. But we can't do it for multifamily housing under the rules that are going into effect. There'll be a report going to the legislature that says, please extend that metering for multifamily to 2029. We have a big federal grant to do that, and we clearly need infrastructure assistance to serve more rural communities. Some are working really hard on that, but more need help for that. We have a big pipeline right now. We thought we were going to get $30 million in ARPA funding, and that was written into the budget bill that if others didn't spend it, that it would come to us, and we were informed over the holidays that it was not going to come to us. And my understanding of the reason is that the ARPA dollars were converted to general fund dollars. And with that went away the deadlines that people had to meet to spend those dollars. So a variety of people said, we want to keep our ARPA dollars. And I would just say to you, we did our job in getting the ARPA dollars out the door, and we have a huge need. And if you can help us with that in the budget adjustment or in the big bill, we are grateful. We'd be grateful for any help. And there are 500 homes and apartments for the balance of this fiscal year that we're considering, including 5 preservation projects that just came on the market where people could be displaced if we're don't have the capacity to intervene.
To clarify here, so the 50 million in potential projects,
That's the value, the amount they'll be asking us for. We have about 13.5 million in state and federal funds remaining for this fiscal year.
so, and you have potentially 50 million in requests
In requests, yes.
that would be funded out of money if you had it in the 26 fiscal year or the 25 fiscal year.
We expect those applications to be to us, not for our January, March meetings, than for our May or June meetings. So we would commit funds in this fiscal year.
So that does not, the 50 million does not include any projects that would come into you
Next fiscal year.
next fiscal year.
But more important than that, and some of you have heard me say this in the past, to be a developer is to take a certain amount of risk, which is to spend money to buy land or option it, to hire design professionals, to begin the permitting process. We had a meeting with all of our regular developers about a week ago to say, we're not getting this $30 million. If the signal to them is that they're not going to get their costs covered down the road, the development pipeline is going to slow down. Now, you will see, we're going to close 25 more projects that we funded this fiscal year. You're going to continue to see, as you will in the next month, there'll be a ribbon cutting for a project in Millbury, be a groundbreaking for that one, for one in Waterbury, a ribbon cutting in Barry. You're going to see projects get produced for the next 2 years based on what you gave us, but the pipeline is going to slow down enormously if people don't think they can get their projects funded. I'm not going to go into regulatory reform today, but one more note on density. The building on the right is on 1/5 of an acre in Winooski, 28 apartments. So if you want to know what 140 units an acre looks like, that's it. That building was built with help from the VA for veterans who have been homeless. I talked at the event about the appeals in Putney, so I won't go into that again. You'll get a report on Act 181. One thing the administration can do, and I've talked with Alex about this extensively, is something called the corrective action plan process when you want to clean up a site, whether it's Sacred Heart, which we're about to break ground up in Newport or in Windsor. Getting your plan approved generally takes 12 to 18 months. And I think we should be asking A&R, what can they do to make that be a 6-month process? Don't need legislation to get them to go faster. They may need more staff. I can't speak for them, but it's way too slow. You asked about permitting, and I think, Mr. Chairman, that we need permit reform is beneficial. We showed this slide a year ago, but This is the project in Shelburne that I talked about, a new neighborhood of 94 units. The permitting fees are $620,000. Act 250 is $103,000. So we want to, the problem with permitting is it creates uncertainty and it can create delay. But it's, if we eliminated all permitting fees, if we told Division of Fire Safety, we told the community no more impact fees, whatever, we'd be saving some money, but it's not what's going to produce a ton of affordable housing. We would produce more certainty, we'd produce faster product, but to get back to my point that we need more capital, that's why we're saying that.
So the permit fees on this particular project were about 2%.
Right? And Act 250, much less than that. We've already talked about energy equity. To get back to housing and conservation, you saw this slide, the building on the left. Were public housing built in the 60s, not in the floodplain, but in the floodway. We replaced it. This year, we used conservation dollars, worked with DEC to restore the Whetstone floodplain. Sir Satsuma Lumber owned this site, removed the berm, took a lot of fill out. And we're told it'll make all of Brattleboro much safer the next time the Whetstone rises. I just want to close with about a 2-week period we had this summer. That just makes me continue to do this after more than 3 decades. We broke ground at Central and Main in Windsor for 25 apartments. We opened a recovery residence on Main Street in Bennington with full support of the community. We broke ground later the next week in Shelburne for those 94 apartments. We had a ribbon cutting for the first shelter in Morrisville, in Hyde Park in Lamoille County that's ever opened, in a former nursing home. We opened what's called permanent supportive housing on Main Street in Burlington, built by the Committee on Temporary Shelter. We broke ground up at the Walmart here, across from the Walmart here in Berlin, and there's, go up there to go shopping. There's now a roof on this building, so buildings are happening. You can see what's changed since midsummer in St. Albans in the TIF district. That building is on its way. And we opened the Riverwalk Apartments, which I showed you earlier. So my point is to leave you with some optimism that lots of good things are happening all over the state. And thank you for what you've given us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your testimony, Mary. You have a
I just have one quick question. There seems to be a lot of seniors living in big family homes, which they would be willing to sell if they had a place to go to. Basically in Rutland, you were on a waiting list. So why aren't we building more like, you know, mixed senior neighborhood kind of housing for these people? And then we could put 2 apartments in.
I think we should build more elderly housing.
Yeah.
We should build more family housing. I mean, there's no part of the housing continuum we don't need more of. One thing that you should just know, and we had this experience years ago when we built an elderly project in Newbury. And Governor Dean came down and he met the first person, so where are you from? New Jersey. But they had kids living in Newbury. They'd moved here. Second person had come from another state. Third person had come back, actually was local to Newbury, but had been living on the other side of the river and had moved back. So people sometimes say they want elder housing, but getting somebody to actually leave their home that they've lived in for 20 or 30 or 40 years is never as easy as anybody thinks it will be. We are collectively with VHMA building many more 1-bedroom apartments. But I also agree with you that there are some elderly folks who would prefer not to live, and I don't think this applies to me as an old man, I think I would like other people, not my age around, but some people would rather, they've done that and they would like elderly only facilities. That's what Cathedral Square is building right now in St. Albans. In that picture I showed, and we did that in Grand Isle, that opened 2 years ago. So we want to do more of that. But it will take more capital to do that, so it will take more capital to build home ownership, to do more mobile homes. Whatever it is we need to do.
When we bought our first house many years ago in Colchester, we paid $24,000 and we used a credit card for down payment.
When we were young, it was a little easier.
Wow.
It was a little easier, you know.
You can't buy a car for that now.
Thank you so much for coming to testify, and I know we'll be asking you for additional information and possibly testimony in the future.
We look forward to the work of this committee, the charge the governor gave us. And we appreciate all the support the General Assembly has given us. When you look at what we've done over the last 4 years, 5,000 units and the 16,000 VHCBs that are involved in, it's because of the investment you've made in us. So thank you.
Yeah.
work.
I'd throw you a parade if I could.
No more praise.
Can you just get, the city council in South Burlington to figure out what they want to do on this?
I didn't bring it up on, yes,
We can talk about that
we
offline.
probably shouldn't. Here comes the whole crew. There he is.
Thanks to each other for a lot about the great work we did. Congratulations.
You, the two of you testify, or they're just.
That really is. Yeah, that's hilarious. Yeah.
We look like one person.
And we got a chair here too, if someone wants their own space. Are you there? Oh, you are?
Me and Lucy Larisha are wearing the same colors, so it looks like one person, but.
You need help here, what you need, wow. Here's my,
Tell me a little bit, yeah, of course. No, as long as I'm here, I think I can run the slide show, right? Hey, you good?
well, let's start by, we're, just for the public, if you're just coming and you are in the House Committee on General and Housing. And today is Wednesday, the 15th. And we are now going to hear from Charlie Baker from Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission and Catherine Dimitri.
Really good.
I have a name that's mispronounced constantly. From VAPCA, the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies. Let me ask the committee, we have a hard stop at 3. Would the committee like a break?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna take, forgive me, we're gonna take 5 minutes. There's,
Yes.
And we also have.
we have until 2:45 for you.
Great.
So that means that we really have a hard stop at 2:45. I apologize, but we can always